This common sense flavour and inclusive character also have a moderating influence on Anglican thought and life. So it's not uncommon for Anglicans to end up somewhere in the middle on any issue. This has become known as the Anglican via media, or middle way. This inclusive, balancing approach runs deep in our DNA. So an Anglican leader's answer to a question will often be, well, on the one hand, but on the other hand. And you hear frustrated journalists and commentators who want to draw lines in the sand or get black and white answers to complex questions, cursing Anglicans for nailing their colours firmly to the fence. The first sentence in the preface to the 1662 Book of Common Prayer says, "It hath been the wisdom of the Church of England, ever since the first compiling of her public liturgy, to keep the mean between two extremes, of too much stiffness in refusing and too much easiness in admitting any variation from it." And what would happen in the development of Anglicanism would be that this mean, this middle way for coping with liturgical disagreement and change, would be expanded into a dynamic and principle applicable even to doctrine. But it's very important to be clear what the via media is and what it isn't. Some people have made the mistake of thinking that finding a middle way is simply compromising matters of principle purely for the sake of peace and an easy life. Some people have made the mistake that it means giving up on the search for truth in the interests of institutional peace and unity. As I mentioned, sometimes you hear it said that you can believe anything you like and still be an Anglican. But that's not what's really going on at all. At the heart of Anglicanism is a constant tension between these three perspectives, where each challenges and corrects the others. So rather than a laissez-faire, anything goes kind of attitude, right at the heart of Anglicanism is a process of dialogue and interaction which requires a great deal of effort and energy to sustain. At the Lambeth Conference of Bishops in 1948, the Orthodox bishops who were there got a bit confused and a bit impatient with the Anglicans about all this talk about comprehensiveness, and they pushed the bishops to be clearer about what they meant when they said Anglicanism is comprehensive, a comprehensive church. If it didn't mean anything goes, what did it mean? And the bishops said this: comprehensiveness is an attitude of mind which Anglicans have learned from the thought-provoking controversies of their history. Comprehensiveness demands agreement on fundamentals while tolerating disagreement on matters in which Christians may differ without feeling the necessity of breaking communion. In the mind of an Anglican, comprehensiveness is not compromise, nor is it to bargain one truth for another. It's not a sophisticated word for syncretism. Rather, it implies that the apprehension of truth is a growing thing. We only gradually succeed in knowing the truth. It's been the tradition of Anglicanism to contain within one body both Catholic and Protestant elements. But there's a continuing search for the whole truth in which these elements will find complete reconciliation. Comprehensiveness implies a willingness to allow a liberty of interpretation with a certain slowness in arresting or restraining exploratory thinking. We tend to applaud the wisdom of the Rabbi Gamaliel's dictum that if a thing is not of God, it will not last very long. Moreover, we are alarmed by the sad experience of too hasty condemnation in the past, as in the case of Galileo. For we believe that in leading us into the truth, the Holy Spirit may have some surprises in store for us in the future, as he has had in the past. Archbishop Temple was even stronger when he said, "There is always an initial presumption in favour of the tradition, for it represents the deposit of innumerable individual apprehensions. Nonetheless, it must be remembered that it is by fresh individual apprehensions that the tradition has been developed. And to reject the new intimation may be not the suppression of human aberration, but a quenching of the divine spirit." So at the heart of Anglicanism is a process of constant dialogue. It fails if it becomes a search for some innocuous common denominator and for compromise in principles in the interests of institutional unity. It can sometimes be taken hostage by extremists in any one of the camps who become absolute about their perspectives and motivated either to convert all others or to exclude them from the communion. The dialectical process implied here is no mere juxtaposition of different views. The talk about via media is really only a description of the dialogue as though it had come to rest in a particular point, some invisible equatorial point. But the reality behind the dialectical process demands continued discussion and never a premature resolution of the tension as imagined in most concepts of the via media. From the very nature of multilateral dialogue, there must be vigour and imagination and persistence and determination, respect for differences and a spirit of reconciliation. No one of the groups should be missing from the dialogue, nor should any be excluded by the others. What's required is not an exhausted and hostile state of non-communication, but the enduring of the tension in confidence that the truth will emerge from the dialogue. What is required by the very nature of the dialogue is not compromise for the sake of peace, but comprehension for the sake of truth. It is difficult. It is hard work to remain engaged with those with whom you differ. It's much easier to go off into a camp with the like-minded and agree with each other and reinforce your own deep confidence that you are right. It requires a maturity to maintain respect, openness to the truth of the insights of the other, preparedness to disagree, and to stay in relationship. That's why the Anglican Church has sometimes been called an ecumenical movement in and of itself. It's a bit like the story of the 4 blindfolded men who were each led to the elephant. One got hold of a tusk and insisted that what they were dealing with was a spear. Another got hold of a leg and was absolutely sure it was a tree. The third was convinced that the elephant's side was a barn, while the fourth had no doubt at all that the tail was a piece of rope. Each understandably grasped only part of a larger truth, which when seen in its entirety resolved all apparent paradoxes and contradictions. The danger that we Anglicans constantly live with is the tendency of one part to see its own particular emphasis as the whole truth and the others as containing no truth at all. That can lead to the twin tragedies of that part either flying off by itself or exerting coercive power to exclude different emphases in an attempt to maintain its pure truth, unadulterated by the errors of others. Were this to happen, the whole dynamic system would fragment and disintegrate, because it's only when each part is held in tension with the others and held in its proper orbit by the others that the whole system hangs together. The image of an atom or a solar system isn't a bad metaphor for Anglicanism. Various elements moving constantly in relation to each other, exerting force and influence on each other, keeping the other bits in their proper orbit and on track. The elements of the system are not really in opposition to each other, but complementary. Remove one thing and the whole system is at risk of collapsing. We know that truth is often paradoxical. Take, for example, the doctrine of the Trinity. God is 3 and God is 1. We affirm that Christ is both truly human and truly God. We affirm that human beings are both predestined by God and yet still exercise free will. Was the resurrection body bodily or spiritual? There's evidence in the New Testament for both views. In Luke, when the risen Jesus appears in the upper room, he eats with them and says, "Look, a spirit does not have flesh and bones, as you see that I have." And yet St. Paul talks in 1 Corinthians about the body being sown a physical body and being raised a spiritual body. Anglicanism tries to live with paradox and ambiguity, not by resolving things in lowest common denominators, but by affirming the truth present in various positions which are in tension with one another. Anglicans attempt to live with apparent contradictions and paradoxes in the belief that God's Spirit will lead us more fully into the larger truth in which ultimately they will be resolved. Now, you might think I'm biased, but I think this Anglican ethos has a lot going for it, and a lot to offer people in our society and world. It's inclusive and comprehensive in the best sense. It's open to new apprehensions of the truth while not allowing us to dispense too lightly with what's been received. It's future-oriented while respecting our inheritance. It pursues the truth with vigour while resisting the temptation to absolutism. It values artistic, imaginative, intuitive, synthesizing ways of knowing alongside the cognitive, rational and analytic. It holds together the importance of the individual and the significance of community. The Anglican ethos is both classical and contemporary, Catholic and Reformed, orthodox and open. What more could anyone want? Sometimes surprises me the whole world isn't Anglican. In the view of some, this voice is weakening and even at risk of disappearing in the face of current evangelical ascendancy and the diminished influence of Anglo-Catholicism in Australia and internationally. Brisbane Diocese is almost uniquely placed in Australia to foster and strengthen this perspective. And I believe we should intentionally inculcate it in our parishes and in our schools and other institutions, because it is a rich and deep and valuable perspective which can make a hugely important contribution to the Church, nationally and internationally, and to the wider community and the world. Understood at depth and owned with confidence and offered generously and imaginatively, this perspective can help us stand against secular materialism. It can help us respond to the rising thirst for spirituality in our society. And it can offer an alternative to fragmentation and exclusion as a means of dealing with pluralism. Our church and our community and our world need this perspective. And I commend this identity and culture to you as a key means of building interest and trust in Anglican Christianity and our organisations, which is one of the key goals in our new mission action plan in the diocese. And I trust and pray that it will characterise more and more the life of our parishes and schools and other institutions. Thank you very much.